Our sermon text this evening is Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 15. So we'll be looking at this passage together. It's really the first half of a larger whole, where the author of the book of Judges gives us kind of a paradigm for what is going to follow in the book, where we see in our passage this evening the first half of that paradigm and the people rebelling against the Lord and the Lord's anger kindled. And then in a few weeks' time, we'll deal with the other half of that paradigm and how the Lord is going to respond by raising up redeemers and delivering them out of bondage. And so, this paradigm, which repeats throughout the rest of the book, we begin seeing this evening in the first half of that in verses 6 through 15. Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, hear now the word of the Lord. And when Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mount of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And so the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. They bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord, and they served the Baals and the Ashereth. And so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in terrible distress. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Well, generational friction seems to be an axiom among human history, doesn't it? The transition from one generation to another, from the older to the younger, seems to be perpetually wrought with strife and with difficulty. And this seems to be a particular problem in our modern age, doesn't it? And it's not just in the proverbial passing of the guard, but rather what I see in our culture now as rather a disregard for the other generations. Younger generations disregarding the older generations, and older generations disdaining the younger generations. In fact, just recently, as I've been scrolling through news stories and things like that, because that's what we do now. You don't turn on the news, you scroll through the news. I noticed a number of different stories talking about the laziness and the entitlement and such on and so forth of this current generation, and how those who are going into the workforce simply won't make it, and that they have no hope. And in fact, we even have phrases that deal with this sort of pessimistic mentality toward the younger generations, don't we? Things like, well, back in my day, we would never get away with that. Or perhaps kids these days, right? Throwing up your hands, not knowing what to do. Or younger children, you're not innocent in this regard either, are you? Because how often, as you're scrolling through social media, do you find those clips making fun of parents' and grandparents' generations for their perhaps lack of technological fluency, or maybe some other feature that you find humorous in light of your own abilities in that regard? We have struggled with this sort of generational friction, and it's reaching a bit of a high point in our lives, I believe, where I fear that the sort of cultural individualism that has been the mark of American life has inundated to what we could call generational individualism, a regard for each new generation to ignore the past and the previous generations to ignore the future one, such that they might, quote-unquote, blaze their own path or walk their own trail. problem, of course, with this can be quite manifold. Blazed paths are much easier to walk than blazing your own. Well-trodden roads and well-laid roads are much better than roads that you have to lay and to work on yourself. And the issue with this, I fear, is not just cultural, but also in the midst of our churches. It's striking to me at times. In light of the great privilege I have in getting to go and to worship at a whole number of other churches that I look around, and one thing I don't see very often is adult children worshiping with their parents, or let alone grandparents with their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. We seem to have this idea where we need to, even if we go to another church of like faith and practice, go on a different road or to find a different way than the one of the generations that came before us. Generational friction, generational strife, which leads, I believe, to a cross-generational failure. A failure on one level or another for the next generation to pick up the baton of the faith and continuing to live the life of righteousness and holiness that God calls his people to live. And it is that very generational friction and strife and failure that Joshua chapter 2, verses 6 through 15 draws our attention to this evening. Because we find ourselves in a time in Israel's history when they are in that friction, they are in the midst of that strife, and we find them on the throes of utter failure. This passage, as it chronicles the death of Joshua the mediator and all the generation that went with him, transitions to the one that is to follow. And how instead of following on the pathway of their fathers, they seek to blaze their own in unfaithfulness and wickedness rather than in righteousness. And as it does so, I kind of hinted at this before reading the passage a little while ago. It actually gives us this structure for the book of Judges. You see, the overarching structure for the book of Judges is revealed for us here in Judges chapter 2, where with each passing generation in the book, we find the pattern of these verses repeated, where the Lord raises up a deliverer for them like unto Joshua and Moses. And for a while they're going to follow the Lord, but then that generation dies. The leader dies with them. And as quick as that leader perishes, the people turn back to the vomits of their sin, cease serving the Lord, and instead forsake him and worship the Baals. It's a pattern that will ensue for the next almost 400 years of Israel's history, and a pattern that needs to be broken. A pattern that, as we'll see this evening, has been broken by the person and work of Christ, who lives and reigns eternally for his people. We'll see this progression in three parts this evening. First, considering the birth of a new generation in verses 6 through 10. And second, the apostasy of Israel in verses 11 through 13. And then lastly, in the anger of the Lord in verses 14 and 15. Well, our passage begins in verse 6, strangely enough, temporally before where the book began in chapter 1, verse 1. Remember, our book began in chapter 1, verse 1, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. And now in chapter 2, verse 6, we're actually back in the lifetime of Joshua, aren't we? When Joshua dismissed the people, this is the dismissal from Joshua chapter 24, and the people of Israel go to take possession of their inheritance. It draws our attention principally, I believe, to a key theme in the book of Joshua. And a key theme in the book of Joshua is this, that God has kept all of his wondrous promises to his people. Not one of them has fallen to the wayside. All of them have been kept. The Lord has been faithful to the promises given to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob, that a numerous nation will come from their seed and that they will inherit this land for their own. And verse 6 draws our attention to the reality that this is taking place, that God has been faithful to his people. And notice especially here, towards the end of verse 7, our passage draws our attention to that, when the author of the Judges writes that generation with Joshua and all those who outlived them had what? had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. We could even say they had seen all the wondrous works that the Lord had done for Israel. Those same sorts of works that we read about a little while ago in Psalm 111, that the congregation was gathered to worship and glorify the Lord for because of his wonderful works of salvation. This generation in the days of Joshua, the Lord had exhibited his faithfulness to them, and in light of that, they were faithful unto the Lord. Verse 7, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all of the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen that great work. Now, I think we need to be careful when we read verses like that. And I think we need to be careful because the literature here is not meant to be a piece of what we could call generational hagiography. It's not the author of Judges looking back in time saying, I wish we were just living in the good old days of Joshua. It's not the Old Testament version of saying this is the greatest generation that ever lived and nobody else could ever measure up to it. Indeed, greater things were yet to come. Indeed, greater things have come for the people of God. No, this is not a call to get back to the good old days. Indeed, we must beware of what I call the false gospel of the good old days. Really, what these verses do is remind us of the wonderful grace and mercy of God. They remind us how God has been faithful to his people. They remind us how God has worked the great events of salvation, especially for them in the Exodus out of Egypt and bringing them into their inheritance. In a sense, these verses preach the gospel to Old Testament Israel and tell them to look to the God of their fathers who has been faithful to them and to trust in that God because he will be faithful to you. Don't turn away from him, but believe upon him, serve him, and serve him alone. Because in serving and believing upon him, you find life, even life eternal. No, this isn't so much about how wonderful Joshua was as a leader. Go read the book of Joshua. He messes up every once in a while as well. It's more about the wonder and testimony of Joshua's God, how he has been faithful to his people, how he has brought them to the land of their inheritance. But as the verses continue into verses 8 through 10, we find ourselves at the cusp of a new age, don't we? Joshua, at the ripe old age of 110, goes to be buried in his inheritance, and the other generation along with him goes to their grave as well. And so the beginning of verse 10, I think, presents us with a time of crisis. And all that generation also were gathered to the Lord. We're at the end of an era. And the end of that era brings us the burning question, what will happen next? Will the next generation follow in the faith of their fathers? Or will the next generation whore themselves out to the gods of the Canaanites? And the second half of verse 10 answers that question for us right here on the front end, doesn't it? And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Now, in the next section, we learn how exactly they don't know the Lord and how exactly they live in light of their lack of knowledge of the Lord. But here on the front end, it draws our attention to an entire generation of people of Israel who, at least broadly speaking, did not believe upon the Lord and did not trust in his work. But as we read those words, a generation who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel, it poses a question for us, doesn't it? Or at least two questions. First, what exactly does it mean to not know the Lord or the works that he has done? And then second, whose fault is it that they don't know these things? So first, what does it mean when our passage tells us that they did not know the Lord or that the work that he had done for Israel? Scholars are divided as to how exactly to interpret these particular things. Some will say that it's all about cognitive knowledge. They simply weren't taught the things of the Lord. They have no, we can say, catechal knowledge of who God is or what he has done. Others go on the opposite end of the spectrum and say, no, it's actually about experiential knowledge. It's not that they hadn't learned about who God is or what he had done. It's that they don't personally take it to heart or believe upon what the Lord, their God, has done for their fathers. One, it's about them not being taught, and the other, it's about them not personally believing. And so what are we to say about these options? Well, I think like we could say a good swirl of a snow or of a ice cream cone or something with chocolate and vanilla mixed together. It's often a little bit of both, isn't it? You see, I would be convinced of it being experiential knowledge or just their lack of belief upon the Lord if the text only said that they did not know the Lord. And I mention that because if you go and you continue reading in the Old Testament, there's many, many times where we come across characters who clearly know who the Lord is, who clearly know the things that he has done for Israel, who are even leaders amongst the people of God, and then the text tells us that they did not know the Lord. For example, Eli and his children in the book of Samuel. Priests and the tabernacle of God, especially Eli's children, while they are raised up in the priesthood and even serving in the priesthood, so they clearly knew who God was. They clearly knew the law of God, and clearly they did not believe it. And so the text tells us they did not know the Lord. They had the cognitive knowledge, but not the heart of faith. And I would be inclined to believe that that's the only thing the text tells us, except that that's not all it says. Because it continues to say that not only do they not know the Lord, but that they also do not know the work that he had done for Israel. You see, there seems to be a problem for the people of Israel, not just in their relational or their experiential knowledge of God, not just in their own hearts of faith, but also in the content of what they are called to confess. It seems like for this following generation of the people of Israel that they are lacking in their confession of God. They're lacking in their knowledge, even cognitive knowledge, about what the Lord had done for his people. And I would remind you that the previous verses drew our attention to that very thing, didn't they? And so it seems like the next generation of Israel, not only are they abandoning the Lord in terms of their personal faith, but they're also struggling with a lack of knowledge about the things that the Lord had done. And I think that interpretation draws us into an answer for the second question as well. Well, whence the problem? What led us to this particular crisis situation in the people of Israel? And again, along with the first question, there are two big options. One camp of commentators will say, well, it's the parents' fault because they didn't teach it to the children. And the other camp will say it's the children's fault because they didn't listen to their parents. I think, as is often the case, once again, the answer is a little bit of both. So the error seems to be, not only is it that the next generation does not personally believe upon the Lord, but also that the previous generation did not properly teach the gospel to their children. You see, the thing that the previous generation experienced in the great and wondrous works of God and salvation being provided for in the wilderness, crossing the Jordan and gaining their inheritance, are the very things that this following generation does not know at the end of verse 10. It seems like the people of Israel have a sort of gospel amnesia, where they seem to have forgotten the wondrous works of the Lord. And as one scholar puts it in his commentary on Judges, amnesia produces apostasy. With their lack of knowledge of the things of the Lord, it's unsurprising that they are quickly going to turn to other and false gods. You see, while Joshua's generation was by and large faithful, that does not mean that they were perfect in all things. In fact, the Bible is very clear, isn't it? In the charge and responsibility and the relationship of a family with both the parents and the children together. A charge for parents to raise up their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and a charge for children to consider the ways of their parents, to lean upon their parents' understanding of the gospel, and to come to know the Lord better through them. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 4 through 7, in the midst of that famous Shema, to confess that the Lord, our God, the Lord is one, Moses continues there to say that the word of God is to be, quote, taught diligently to your children. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house and you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 12, Moses continues here instructing them about when they enter into the land and find all of those wonderful blessings that the Lord has promised. He says, verse 12, Deuteronomy 6, take care, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You remember our reading from Deuteronomy 31 a little while ago? We can almost see similar themes from Deuteronomy 6 and even Judges chapter 2 there. Take care. Take care that when you go into this land that is flowing with milk and honey, that the satisfaction you have in this life does not lead to spiritual complacency. Take care that you continuously dedicate yourself unto the Lord, that you center the gospel in your life such that you would believe upon this God of our salvation and not turn aside to other gods. And it was the charge, wasn't it? It was the charge for the people of Israel, Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I think in light of this teaching, the charge for parents today to do that very thing as well. To instruct your children in the way of the Lord. To talk about the Lord and his work of salvation wrought by Christ. To take care lest we forget the Lord who has saved us and brought us out of the tyranny of sin and misery. It is part of the wonderful privilege and responsibility of parents to raise up their children in the Lord. And it is a privilege, isn't it? It is a privilege to pass on the faith from one generation to the next, to teach the Word of God to the children that we love and care for so dearly, to guide them on the pathway of righteousness for God's name's sake, and to prayerfully and longingly desire for them to follow upon that pathway as well. Let me be clear here. We do have a responsibility to do it. It is a wonderful privilege and it is a responsibility. But it's also not our power to save our children. That power rests with God and God alone. We cannot parent our children into heaven's bright shores. No, that privilege rests in the hands of God alone, who saves people by the power of his grace as an exercise of his mercy through his Spirit, working faith even in young children's hearts. But that does not mean that God does not use the parents as a secondary cause to teach that faith to their children. Indeed, it is a great privilege and a great responsibility not only to the parents but also to the child, isn't it? What a blessing it is when a child is born into a believing family who takes the instructions of Scripture seriously to teach the things of the Lord unto them, to have the Word of God read in their ears year in and year out, to have a family that prays for and with their children, and even to rear up children that come to their parents to learn the things of the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7, speaking to the children, Moses there says, even in that song that Deuteronomy 31 was talking about, to remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. Children, do you remember the end of the fifth commandment? I'm sure parents love the front part, honor your father and your mother. It's an important one. I think we have that discussion at least 3 times a day in our household. But it ends in a promise, doesn't it? It ends in a promise, Deuteronomy 5:16, that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Yes, the pathway might be narrow, but it is also well-trodden. It is well-trodden by the fathers and mothers of the faith who have come before us. And children, you do well to listen. You do well to learn. You do well to come to them and ask them of the things of the Lord. And you do well. You do well to follow on the pathway of faith that is set before you, and godly parents seeking to raise godly children. Yes, there is a wonderful privilege and responsibility from both sides of this equation. But here, for this passage and dealing with this particular generation of Israel, again, remember amnesia, specifically amnesia concerning the gospel or the wondrous works of God, produces apostasy. And this is exactly what happens in the life of the people of Israel, isn't it? Because notice the particular sin of this generation who does not know the Lord or what he had done for them, where the people of Israel did what is evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. One of the things I love about teaching Hebrew is really slowing down and looking carefully at the text. And one thing in verse 11 jumped off the page to me is that in the Hebrew it does not say that Israel did what was evil. It actually says Israel did the evil. And I find that remarkable because it really heightens what the text is talking about, isn't it? It's not telling us that Israel did a little bad thing, but it's really not all that serious. It doesn't tell us about just their going around and doing something that's not really all so bad, but rather that they are doing the evil, the number one sin that the Bible wants to draw our attention to, and it is the sin of idolatry and apostasy. The people of Israel, this new generation who does not trust in God, nor do they know the gospel of God, instead turns away from God to worship and serve the gods of the Canaanites, specifically in these verses, Baal and Asherah. They do the evil. And while serving these idols is clearly against the word of the Lord, it is clearly evil in his sight. The evil that the people of Israel experience or engage in here is far more than just idolatry. It is, as our text puts it, abandoning the Lord. Or as I would like to translate it, they forsook the Lord. Not only is it that they are pursuing these false idols, but even as they are doing it, they are forsaking the living and true God. They are forsaking the one God who has the power to redeem them out of Egypt and to bring them into this inheritance. They are whoring, as the text says in verse 17, after other gods rather than the one God of Israel. You see, as they go after these other gods, it's not like you can have this God and those gods. The reality of the faith of Israel, the reality of the Christian faith is that it is exclusive, isn't it? You cannot worship the God of Israel, the Lord, and go and join that worship to other false gods as well. When you are joined together to a covenant community and covenant commitments unto the Lord our God, there are no halfway measures. You do not join together the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Canaanite deities. No, the Lord demands of you holy and exclusive love. He demands that your devotion be completely and unapologetically holy unto Him, and that if you pursue anything else for greater comfort or for worship in this life, then you are engaging in the same apostasy of Israel here. Now, it's easy to see this apostasy, isn't it, when there's objective idols, Baal and Asherah. But as John Calvin famously said, our hearts are idol factories, aren't they? Regularly churning out these things of the world that we would much rather glorify and enjoy rather than the Lord of glory Himself. We must be on guard, brothers and sisters, on guard against the sin of our own hearts, and to work constantly to center the Lord in our lives and seek to make much of Him and to live for His glory forevermore. The evil that the people of Israel do The reason why they provoke the Lord to anger is they forsake the Lord and they worship the idols of the nations rather than the Lord of glory. In fact, I like the language of forsook here for another reason. It's because this is actually the exact same language that the Bible uses to speak of divorce. And one of the key motifs that the Scriptures use to talk about the relationship that God has to His people is the relationship of a husband to a wife. In a sense, when you confess and believe upon Christ, you are wedded unto Him. And that wedding unto Him as His bride and He as your bridegroom calls you to exclusive love and to exclusive commitment. And so whenever you do pursue those things of the earth, whenever you pursue the things of this world and trust and rest in them rather than trusting and resting in the Lord, it is an act not only of sin, but of faithlessness, of forsaking your husband who loves you and gave himself for you. In light of that, it's no surprise that at the end of our passage in verses 14 through 15 take us to see the just response of the Lord to Israel's apostasy. As Israel whores themselves out to the gods of the nations, notice the end of verse 12, they provoked the Lord to anger. But now in verse 14, the subject matter of the verse shifts, doesn't it? It's not about the actions of Israel, but rather the response of the Lord. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. God is not indifferent to sin, least of all the sins of His people. The Lord your God is a jealous God, isn't He? His jealousy is really His zeal for exclusive love and commitment unto you. And so whenever the people of God in particular turn away from God unto idols, when they engage in this apostasy, God cannot be indifferent to it. Instead, it strikes at the very core of His holiness and majesty, doesn't it? Because God, as He calls a people out of bondage to sin and misery, there's a positive aspect of that too, isn't there? Where He is calling you to live lives of righteousness and holiness, to be like unto God who is holy and righteous. And He's even rescuing you from sin and misery, not to put you in a neutral state, but rather to restore you back to union and communion with Him. And so whenever people who are joined together to His church, who profess faith in the Lord, turn back to these idols, it is, we could say, sinning with a double portion. It is not just idolatry, it is apostasy. It is not just living the life of sin, it is forsaking the Lord whom you once confessed. And in light of that, our passage takes us to consider the just recompense for sin, doesn't it? Where the Lord in His anger gives Israel over to plunderers, verse 14, who plunder them. He sells them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, such that they would no longer stand before them. The result of Israel's apostasy is that the God who is with them to bring them into their inheritance is now the God who stands against them in their inheritance. Notice verse 15. Whatever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm. And remember the book of Exodus. It is the outstretched hand and arm of the Lord that redeems them in His might out of the land of Egypt. But now the arm, the hand that was once for them, is the arm and the hand that stands against them because of their apostasy and sin. The Lord responds with a curse of the covenant. In fact, the handing over of the people of Israel to plunderers or to the enemies who are around them, if you go and read the various covenant passages in the Pentateuch, so passages like Deuteronomy 28 or Joshua 23 and 24, you find that is one of the curses of the covenant. It is the just response of God to the people of Israel for their sin. But perhaps most important for these verses, and perhaps the most important thing for us to consider in these verses, is that it takes us not just to the curse of the covenant, not just to God's just response against Israel for their sin, but rather to the God whom Israel has sinned against. It takes us to consider not only that Israel provokes God to anger, but that it is the God of Israel that is angry with them because of their sin, to reckon with the reality that it is the infinite and eternal and all-powerful God that is pouring out the recompense for sin upon Israel. It tells us of the truly dangerous and ominous position that sinners and idolaters and those who engage in apostasy have before the Lord of glory. It warns us, doesn't it, of the terrible wrath of God, His just mercy against sin, the danger that all of those who go to live on this wide path of treachery and apostasy have but one end in the second death and the lake of fire. It warns us, it sobers us to consider our own lives, to guard ourselves against idolatry, to fight against indwelling sin, but perhaps above all, to ask the question, well then what is the remedy? What is the remedy? Well, the remedy is found in this. It's in a prayer. Offer up to the Lord, Lord, in wrath, remember mercy. The remedy is found in the merciful and gracious character of God. In fact, we'll get into this in the next paragraph of the book, in the next sermon. Notice verse 16, the Lord raised up judges who saved them. It's remarkable, isn't it? That as the Lord in His burning anger for the forsaking and apostasy of Israel, as He pours out even His just judgment against them, even in verse 16, we're drawn to the character of God as one of grace and mercy and steadfast love, who saves a forsaking people, who saves an abandoning people, who saves an apostate people and brings them back to Himself. And that, brothers and sisters, is where we find the remedy. And God, who is gracious and merciful, even indeed who is so gracious and merciful that He would send His own Son into the world to be a propitiation for our sins. A Son. You remember what we read about in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9 earlier, who, although a son, He learned obedience through what He suffered, and being made perfect, He became the source, the fountainhead of eternal salvation to all who obey Him. Christ, as He lived that perfectly righteous life and went to the cross as our perfect sacrifice for sin, upon being made perfect in His resurrection from the dead, became the fountainhead of life for all who believe upon Him by the grace of God, through the operation of the Spirit of God in faith, who rest upon Christ and find hope in the midst of a hopeless and barren land, who find faith, perhaps even in the midst of a faithless generation. I've said before in this introduction to the book of Judges, as we're kind of getting into the main body of the book in the coming weeks, the story of Judges is the story of sin and misery. It's a story of Israel's regular and rampant apostasy from the Lord. But it's also the story of God's persistent and perpetual grace and mercy to a wayward people. And there, brothers and sisters, you can find hope. Because in wrath, God remembers mercy. Even in the context of the dire need, even for God's justice to be poured out, He sent His Son to do that very thing, such that all who believe upon Him are rescued from wrath, are brought into His mercy, and restored as a holy, redeemed generation, children in the Son of God, who believe upon Him and rest upon Him for their salvation.